So finally, let's get into kind of a tracking discussion for the last few minutes of class. Design software, we talk in our Design Your Solar Roof class, really greatly speeds the rapidity of which you can model projects. Here we have Helioscope, which will let you do ground mount modeling. You can do basic ground mount modeling and basic ground mount one-line diagrams in a matter of minutes. You can take that array size and plug it into Energy Toolbase and do very detailed economic modeling and get spreadsheets that'll make your CFO smile. We're talking about, modified internal rate of returns, net present value analysis, return on investment analysis. All that can be done through Energy Toolbase, pictured on the right. And then we have, I often will use either Aurora or Helioscope to do my shade modeling and performance estimating. Of course, you could always use PV Watts for that. And then I'll hop into Energy Toolbase, which is a paid software. So is Aurora, so is Helioscope. PV Watts is the only one. PV Watts and then the next step up, System Advisor Model, are free. These are easier to use. Well, I'll model in Energy Toolbase the economic model, and then I'll go and generate my National Electric Code or one-line diagram in Solar Design Tool. The reason why all that's important is that in order to apply for your project, the utility is going to want you to see some development work. They're going to want to see your design, your proposal, and it doesn't take weeks to develop a solar interconnection application or solar proposal anymore. We tried to do a community solar program in Mississippi under TVA's program. TVA at the time was offering a 6-cent PPA, so about half retail price of electricity out here. And in order to do that, we had to develop all the design work for a 350 kilowatt array just to apply for the program. So the electrical co-op that we're in said, well, generate all the documentation and we'll consider it for the TVA 6-cent PPA, which again is half of retail electricity out here. And so in a matter of a day, I was able to generate the one-line diagram, the National Electric Code report, the financial model, and then I had to dig into my contract background to develop the solar leasing documents to be routed through legal if the project was accepted. So we got all the documentation together for the utility, even though we only had like a 2-week time frame to piece it all together. And at that point, the utility said, well, actually, we're not going to consider your application because we don't know if it's in the financial interests of our electric co-op members. And then when we said, well, how could selling you guys electricity at half a retail value and you getting fully compensated from the TVA have any impact on your ratepayers other than to lower the price of energy and bring renewables onto the grid? Their response was, well, we just don't have time to deal with it right now. Their own program, they don't have time to deal with. So, they told us no, but we used design software, and that was disappointing, but design software meant that we had only invested, a dozen man-hours into the development rather than hundreds. If you want to develop your own community solar project, you could consider solar leasing. We talk about solar leasing in other classes. Leasing in general, solar or a car or anything is going to be more expensive than direct ownership because there's costs involved. But now for the TVA to get access to the 6-cent, sometimes it's 4-cent PPA, you have to do a community solar project. So what if you wanted to develop your own community solar program? Well, one thing to consider is a leasing model. A solar lease is nothing but an operating lease. So your accountant, your financial planner, they may know nothing about solar leases. But if you talk to them about equipment operating leases, they'll say, well, equipment operating leases have to abide by certain rules. They cannot be for the entire asset life. They can only be for 20 years. So in the news, you see Tesla pushing for a recognized life of a solar module. The warranty is often for 25 or 30 years. They would like the recognized life of a solar array to be 30 years, if not 40 years, because that will extend the duration of Tesla's solar leases as a standard offer. Utilities could borrow a page from that book. If they start recognizing a 30 or 40-year life out of a solar array, their community solar contracts could be much longer. A lease provider is responsible for insurance and maintenance. You can structure it as a service agreement tied to price of electricity, or as a true lease agreement where you pay a fixed monthly fee regardless of the cost savings produced that are somewhat equivalent to those cost savings. And that's so you get out of selling electricity rather than leasing the use of equipment. And, that's a fine line. That really depends how much of that line you want to spell out. It really depends on how anti-solar and how regulated your electric grid is. If you're on a regulated utility and you want to put a solar array through a behind-the-meter transaction and you want to finance solar from it, you can. Here's a company called Arcadia Power. And they have a community solar option. And I think their community solar option is pretty cool. Let me click on it and check their availability. And so what they allow you to do is to take existing solar arrays that are already installed in the field on rooftops all around the country, and basically you're buying out the owner of the array with a financing package to say, what Arcadia Power's program effectively is a 7-year 0% interest, or maybe a 1% interest, very low 7-year buy-in, where you effectively get your money back after 7 years, assuming Arcadia Power stays in business. But for the solar project owner, that additional 7 years means of 0% interest financing means that they can float their construction loans, their capital equipment loans, even some of their 7-year capital equipment loans they can get out of paying the interest on, and that might be the difference between a profitable and an unprofitable project. And so we have voluntary customers not really making any kind of return on investment, but still, they're only chunking $400 at a project, and it's all about creating a customer experience that feels like they're the owner of the solar panel. Again, you don't get any RECs. You can't claim you're solar owned. You're getting an app on your phone that says this is your solar production, and that blurs the lines of double counting, but no one in the community solar sector cares about those blurred lines. They say, well, if it brings projects out of the ground, then stop grousing about it. When I put in these slides about solar leasing, the concern is that if you don't do a solar lease, then you really need the utility on board. If I do a behind-the-meter transaction where this customer is using solar on their rooftop and they're getting compensation from the electric bill, and effectively all I'm doing with Arcadia Solar's program is financing the array, giving them a $400 micro loan for 7 years at a very low interest rate. For that's more like financing solar. It's not like getting a credit on your electric bill itself. Leasing is kind of like financing solar, where you could write a lease agreement where they buy in at the equivalent of $2 or $3 or $4 a watt, and then they receive a monthly payment where, you know, they're buying the asset and you're leasing it from them, kind of like a reverse lease. This is all to say that you're trying to get out of selling electricity to the customer. If you sell electricity to the customer, your local utility may say, well, you're not licensed to sell electricity. And then if you're selling a long-term investment opportunity to the customer, the SEC may say, well, you're not licensed to sell securities. And so if I'm offering a 7-year loan on a solar project, the SEC might say this is a security. If I'm offering a buy-in to a solar project that's supposed to produce a regular return, that could be construed as a security, especially if it's not explicitly written as a clear as day equipment operating lease. And so I recommend leasing models if you want to develop your own utility or your own community solar program without utility consent, because you can find an off-taker of the array. You go find someone who could use a 1 megawatt rooftop array, and then you sign up community members to effectively, you know, fund the project through, you know, a sale leaseback agreement where they're buying it and then leasing it back to you, and you set the lease payments and buy-in rates to make, you know, to make sure that the project is, you know, financially to your benefit. I guess I'm getting into utility scale solar here, but the point is structuring the project as the lease rather than as a security is a common concern in the solar industry. But just yesterday in discussion, I got pointed to this document, which I'm going to put in the chat box because it's not in the program and it's worth knowing about. So that should pop up in your chat box now. And it commented on, is community solar a security? This was actually written in 2015, and there's a company called Community Sun, that's a solar developer, that requested SEC guidance on whether or not they're creating a security with a community solar or shared solar project. And there's some rules and regulations here, but ironically, what it said is community solar projects avoid SEC regulation because they are not considered a security. And for greater detail on that, it says participation is not considered a security because it's not considered an investment contract. You know, in other words, you know, the SEC, National Renewable Energy Labs, all the developers of these community solar projects, they all know that there's very little financial benefit to participate in community solar, and that the participants are not primarily motivated by financial benefit, but instead are looking to, you know, help the environment, help local solar, offset their power, not through the utility green choice program, but through community solar participation. And for all those reasons, the SEC has said, this is not an investment vehicle. This is more like something fun that people are buying, so we're not going to regulate it as a security. Just a word of advice, 2 words. 1, I'm not a CPA. 2, just because at the federal level the SEC isn't looking into it doesn't mean that you aren't subject to other state or local securities statutes that may differ from what the Fed thinks about community solar. But the point is, I used to have a big section on why solar leasing is so good, and but now it seems that securities are not as much of a concern, at least federally, on are you creating a investment vehicle with your community solar program. The answer is no, but that's because none of these solar programs are you know, have much investment investment value to the participant. In the future, if community solar does have financial value to the participant, maybe that'll change. Utility scale solar can get very cheap. This was a budget that we put together for a this is a project that we put together for a 350 kilowatt solar project in 2015. You can see I was really busy or I was really hungry for some work. I really wanted to do the first community solar project in Mississippi, and at 6 cents a kilowatt hour, we had to utilize tracking and dirt cheap material in order to achieve this budget. It turned out that the utility decided not to bless our application, and we needed that utility blessing to move forward. So this never came out of the ground. But we were looking at bargain bin modules, although nowadays at 350 kilowatts, you could probably get your modules for 40 cents and still have them be tier 1 modules. Inverters get cheaper at scale. Racking gets cheaper. Actually, in our other classes, we talk about how residential racking budgets might be 22 cents a watt, and this shows a little bit more than that. This is for a tracking solar array. So we're going to talk about a tracker in just a minute. Balance of systems gets cheaper. Labor gets a lot cheaper. Equipment rental gets a lot cheaper. The only thing that really doesn't get cheap in utility scale are the interconnection fees. A lot of interconnection fee cost comes from running the wires between the utility solar farm and your point of interconnection. And so if you're right next to high voltage transmission lines, that's great. If you aren't, it can cost you up to $5 a foot for incredibly thick cable that'll support a 2 megawatt solar array. And so if you're a mile from the interconnection grid, that could cost you, 25 grand, if not even more than that. Tracking budget is for tracking. So, well, first off, for any utility scale project, what you want is flat, level land that you can drive a pile into. If you can do pile driving, you avoid, buying thousands of yards of concrete. So if your soil is good for pile driving, that's the way to go. And really, if your soil is rocky, if your terrain is not level, then a fixed in place array is how you want to do it. But if you have flat land that you can drive a pile into, that's a good candidate for tracking. The reason why I say 350 kilowatts is, I have found that the utility scale tracking companies will require a minimum purchase volume for them to work with you. I mean, they're so busy on 60 megawatt, 100 megawatt projects that they just simply won't sell to you without a certain project volume. I'm able to get utility scale trackers at a 350 kilowatt purchase block, which is about the best that I've heard of in the industry. Usually they want 1 or 2 megawatts minimum. As far as the electrical design goes, utility scale solar designs about as easy as residential solar, particularly up to 4 megawatts. You think about it, if your utility is willing to provide a 4 megawatt commercial service to a business, they have the transformer and everything that you need to interconnect a 4 megawatt solar array. So you're dealing with 200 amp circuits instead of 20 amp circuits. You're dealing with 800 amp service panels instead of residential 200 amp service panels. And maybe you're wiring multiple 1 megawatt arrays onto that single 4 megawatt transformer. One thing that we learned doing our 1 megawatt was that it's the same transformer shell for a 1 megawatt array versus a 2 megawatt array. So already, there's some economies of scale that suggest 2 megawatts is better than 1. Here's our one line diagram where we have where we're still using, and I wouldn't do this again, but we're still using module level electronics where we have a solar edge optimizer behind every 2 modules going into a string inverter that's going into a service panel that's going into a main distribution panel. And at the utility scale, you have a design. Do you want to do multiple string inverters, or do you want to do just a couple central inverters? I used to be a multiple string inverter guy. I am no longer a multiple string inverter guy. It's way too much wiring. I'm diving headfirst now into minimizing failure points in a system, and so I like having just 1 or 2 big hulking central inverters instead of a lot of distributed string inverters. In terms of community solar project structuring, you can have the utility on board, or you can go and negotiate your own agreements, doing sales leaseback agreements. Here's what we did for a community solar platform that does not really have the utility on board. What the utility was doing with our project was providing a PPA to the project developer, kind of like Middleburg, Tennessee, same program. The utility pays 6 cents a kilowatt hour for the electricity, and then we have an underwriter who says, well, I'll build a solar array at 6 cents and it'll be profitable for me. But then the utility said, no, to do our program, now you have to do a community solar layer. And so what our community solar layer was basically having 10 kilowatt blocks of our 350 kilowatt array available for a sale leaseback arrangement, where the idea was that individual homeowners or business owners who couldn't put solar on their roof would come in and buy a 10 kilowatt hour block, a 10 kilowatt block, and then receive lease payments back based on, you know, how much they bought. Or we could finance that upfront purchase and basically make the project not economic for the payer. What we're doing is adding a sale leaseback equipment lease to our what would otherwise be a single developer and a single PPA in order to create a community solar program. A CPA, a corporate CPA familiar in equipment operating leases and sale leaseback arrangements should be within their skill set to put something like this together, particularly because, you know, companies like Solar City have copies of their solar leases available that you can kind of borrow terms and conditions from. When you get into utility scale development, it seems the preferred structure is either a partnership flop or something a little bit more complicated called an inverted lease structure, which is beyond my ability to really tell you why this works. But basically, at the utility scale, you have a company like Berkshire Hathaway sitting there that says, I pay, you know, billions of dollars in taxes, and so I have all the tax liability I could ever need. You have a developer, have a PPA with the utility and the ability to develop a project, but you don't have enough taxes to claim the tax credit on a, you know, 100 megawatt solar array that would come with, you know, $30 million of tax credits. But you also can't sell the solar tax credit like you can with housing tax credits. And so you have to have this complicated business structure so that the ownership of the array for the first few years is owned by the tax equity investors so that they can depreciate it and claim the tax credits, and then later the ownership transfers back to the developer so that they can get more revenue and maintain the array over time. And that's what we see in the Geronimo Berkshire Hathaway relationship. They build the array, they transfer ownership to Berkshire Hathaway for tax purposes, and then later we'll probably see that ownership transfer back to the developer.